All right, let's dive in. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating interview that looks at a growing and pretty controversial trend. It's all about how online influencers might be reshaping modern conservatism. We're going to break down the arguments about how this new kind of political conversation gets built, and, what the consequences could be.
So it all really boils down to this one big question. With so much chatter online, how can you possibly tell what's just internet chaos versus something that actually spills over and affects the real world? It's a debate that gets right to the heart of how we all live now.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The source argues that for older generations, there's this bright line, right? There's online life, and then there's real life. But for younger people, that line has basically vanished. For them, life just flows seamlessly between the two. What happens online isn't some separate universe. It is their real world. So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll look at whether this is a real threat or just noise. Then we'll dig into the specific claims about a new kind of Christian anti-Semitism. After that, we'll break down the influencer playbook, figure out why young people are tuning in, and finally, look at the potential cost to society. Okay, so let's tackle that first point. Is this a real threat? The source makes it clear that while hard data might be tough to come by, the anecdotal evidence, the stories from people on the ground, is pretty startling. We're about to hear from people who are seeing a major shift with their own eyes. And that leads us right into the core concern raised in the material. It's this perceived rise in not just anti-Semitism, but also a broader anti-Western feeling, and it's supposedly coming from a new wave of online conservatives. And wow, check out this quote. This really drives the point home. It's attributed to Senator Ted Cruz, speaking to a room full of Christian Zionists. It's presented as this huge red flag, a warning that something is seriously changing, even inside communities you'd think would be the most supportive. But it's not just about that one issue. According to the source, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's all part of a bigger package deal. Talking points that include being pro-authoritarian, defending countries like China, Russia, and Iran, and saying they aren't actually enemies of the West. The argument is that all these ideas are connected. And here's the big warning, the real takeaway from this section. The source talks about this domino effect. It uses this really powerful metaphor that everything starts to rot and disintegrate, arguing that once anti-Semitism gets a foothold in a movement, it's a sign of a much deeper decay that's going to spread everywhere else.
Okay, so if these ideas are spreading, how is it actually happening? What's the method? That brings us to what the source calls the influencer playbook. It's basically a step-by-step strategy for how online figures supposedly build up a following and then slowly, carefully, introduce them to more and more extreme ideas.
So let's break this playbook down. Step 1, you lure people in. You use edgy but non-political stuff, like hot takes on celebrities. Then comes step 2, build trust. You become that familiar, friendly voice in their feed. Once you have that trust, step 3, you start to sprinkle in the conspiratorial political ideas. And then, the final and most important step, you validate all their negative emotions. You tell them that their anger, their rage, their confusion, it's all completely justified.
And that's the whole point, right there. The source claims this isn't about getting followers to think for themselves. It's about weaponizing their emotions, their bitterness, their rage, and aiming it outwards. It's all about validating this tear it all down kind of thinking, which, interestingly, the source compares to tactics sometimes used on the political left.
So that's the playbook. But the real question is, why is it working? Why are young people, in particular, so receptive to these messages right now? This next part digs into the reasons the source gives for that.
Well, the source paints a picture of this kind of perfect storm of issues. You've got economic despair, feelings of shame or rage being pushed by the culture, and real loneliness from being isolated behind a screen. Add to that a desperate search for anyone to blame for their unhappiness. The argument is that if you're not taught to take personal responsibility, you're going to be looking for a scapegoat.
And this slide just lays it out so clearly. On one side, you have the traditional view, take responsibility, be accountable. On the other side, you have this new influencer narrative, and it's a powerful one. It says, hey, it's not your fault, you're a victim, there's an evil system out there, and that's who you should blame. You can see why that message would be so appealing if you feel lost.
So you might be thinking, okay, but how many people actually fall for this? Well, the source makes a really interesting point. You don't need a majority. History suggests that it only takes about 10% of a population to kick off a revolution.
And get this, to change an entire political party, The number's even smaller. The source suggests it might be less than 5%. The point is, you just need a small, really dedicated, really fired up group to have a huge impact on the culture, which then eventually changes the politics.
All right, this all leads us to our final and maybe most important section. What's the real cost here? What are the potential long-term consequences for society if these trends keep growing?
You know, it all circles back to this idea the source calls the victim complex. It's the core belief they're selling, that your problems, your failures, they're not on you. No, they're the fault of some big evil system, with a convenient scapegoat, which the source says is often identified as the Jewish people, to pin it all on.
And the danger here, the big warning from the source, is what this does to a society. When you replace personal responsibility with a culture of blame, things start to fall apart. If nobody is accountable for anything because there's always some external enemy to point fingers at, the very foundation of how a society works can start to crumble.
And what makes all this worse is just the world we live in now. The sheer amount of information hitting us every second. The source suggests we're so overloaded that we have no memory. An influencer says something crazy, and before you can even fact-check it, you've already scrolled past 20 other things. This makes accountability almost impossible, and it lets these ideas spread like wildfire.
And that leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. If a culture built on personal responsibility fades away and gets replaced by a culture of blame, what exactly is left to hold a society together? That's a powerful thought to end on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.